Contemporary Russian and Soviet History. He's also the founding and executive editor of Kritika, which is one of the leading, or maybe the leading journal in Russian history, which fortunately, again, he brought with him to Georgetown, as well as all his scholarly prowess. He's going to talk to you tonight about his latest book, Showcasing the Great Experiment, Cultural Diplomacy and Western Visitors to the Soviet Union, 1921 to 41. If you would like to buy the book, there is a table out there with someone who will be able to sell you the book afterwards, and we will, of course, have a reception afterwards. I think Michael is going to talk to you maybe about the writing of this book and the research, so we welcome you.
Thank you, Angela, and I just want to say to begin that the welcome that I've been given here at Georgetown, both by my colleagues in the School of Foreign Service and in the History Department, has really been tremendous, and it has meant a lot to me. And I want to thank especially some of my students for coming to this, since they've just sat through over an hour on revolutionary culture after 1917, but their thirst for Russian studies is unquenched. And I've been giving a lot of talks around at various different places about this book with slides and PowerPoint and a very formal lecture, but for a kind of hometown crowd, so to speak, I thought I would do something quite different, and that is simply to talk for more informally and more briefly about how I came to write this book and how some of its major themes emerge, sort of a backstory, and then we can turn to questions before the more serious business of eating and drinking. The origins of this book actually go way back into the mists of time, back to when I was an undergraduate looking for a senior thesis topic at Princeton, and I decided to write about the image of the Soviet Union in the American left liberal journals, magazines, The Nation and The New Republic. And so I wrote a senior thesis on the rather positive image of the Soviet Union on the American left in the 1930s, but not in the communist left, among the non-communist and liberal left. And in the years that followed, so this got me into the whole literature on fellow travelers and Western visitors to the Soviet Union. And I noticed then and in the years that followed how much of the literature on the topic of intellectuals and communism, Western observers and the Soviet Union, had been written not by Soviet or Russian historians, basically not by experts on Soviet history, but by people who were looking at the Soviet Union from various other perspectives. And the two classic and I think most important works on this topic were David Kaut's The Fellow Travelers and Paul Hollander's book Political Pilgrims, which went through with 4 editions, I believe, after it was published in 1981. And both of those books have some great merits to them. Both of them really delved into the biographies of some of the observers and travelers, but neither of them used Soviet sources, and none of them really delved into what the travelers were doing and saying when they were inside the Soviet Union. That is to say, the sources that were generated from inside the Soviet Union. And so what light could that shed? That was my major sort of initial interest. And the initial interest in writing this book also came to the fore with the so-called archival revolution and the opening of the former Soviet archives. And I learned that over approximately 100,000 foreign visitors had visited the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s, starting mainly in the early 20s, and including tens of thousands of writers and intellectuals and professionals. And then, of course, it tapers off into a virtual trickle during the years of the Great Terror. Incidentally, my advisor for my Princeton senior thesis was a young assistant professor named Daniel Rogers, who went on to write a very path-breaking book in transnational history called Atlantic Crossings. And when I returned to Princeton a couple of years ago as a fellow at the Davis Center, he had completely forgotten about my senior thesis written some 20 years before, but in the course of my stay, he remembered it, and by the end of the stay had been already sort of claiming credit for inspiring the book. But it was really actually quite an interesting experience to me because it made me realize how many of my interests actually had remained constant, even though, you know, so many things had changed and my outlook had changed in many, many ways. But so that was quite interesting. But at any rate, by the 90s, I had come to realize that the Soviet side of the equation, what was, after all, one of the most significant cross-cultural encounters of the 20th century and political episodes in the political history and intellectual history of the 20th century, the Soviet side of that equation had remained something of a black box. And that's when the new archival sources kicked in, and the more immediate inspiration for writing this book came in the 1990s, in the rather wild post-Soviet decade, when I spent a lot of my time in Russia and a lot of that time in the reading room of the State Archive of the Russian Federation, which at that point in those years, the so-called spetschrony, the special secret parts of all archival collections, were being declassified. And the list of the materials of the declassified collections was actually posted in the reading room of the archive. And this was, of course, before the Putin era, when the classification wave trickled off, and in some cases we've seen some reclassification. But basically my attention was drawn to this list sometime in the late 1990s when I saw that the secret part of the rather large collection of an organization called the All-Union Society for Cultural Ties Abroad was declassified. And that society was known by its Russian name, its acronym VOX. And VOX was the Soviet agency in charge of receiving foreign visitors classified as members of the intelligentsia, which included, for example, technical specialists, but basically the realm of culture and the realm of the intelligentsia was their purview, but also crafting the image of the Soviet Union abroad for certain audiences and keeping track of cultural developments in foreign countries. So VOX became the key agency in the 20s of Soviet cultural diplomacy. And by the late 1990s, I had looked into this collection enough to know that, one, it was truly massive. Just the sheer size of it was, there was a huge amount of material that had not been seen or written about. And it took me something like 8 research trips that totaled 2 years to more or less systematically go through. And I had narrowed it down by concentrating, not completely, but really focusing on those countries that VOX and the Soviets in the early years really thought of as the most important, and that was namely the West, Central and Western Europe and the United States. But I did some forays into other countries for comparison, but even that was really a huge cache of materials. I later supplemented it with other materials, but that became the backbone. The VOX archive became the backbone of this book. And I had seen enough about it to realize that it had some very interesting types of documents. It had letters from foreigners. It had reports of the guides and translators who were taking the foreigners around, their itineraries. It had correspondence with the friendship societies in other countries that were set up. The first was in Berlin in 1923. And this was very different from the kind of dry, bureaucratic documentation that much of Soviet history comprises. And so it seemed to me kind of an interesting, even though I had focused on this era before, it was a radically different type of angle into the 20s and 30s. And it also contained high-level secret police and high-level political materials that sometimes were not available in other collections, but of course foreigners often a kind of high-level political topic, and so I was able to access a sort of entree into the secret police or the KGB archives. The former KGB archives are still the most closed, part of the Soviet system in terms of archival access. And finally, I'd say, sort of more prosaically, but not insignificantly for me, was that these materials were not microfilmed; they were all in hard copies. And I had this experience of near electrocution by a Soviet microfilm reader when I tried to plug it in. I sort of felt the waves of electricity coursing through my arm, and I had this kind of near-death experience of just having the original documents. Those documents are very hard to read on microfilm, so I think I spared my eyes also by deciding to write about this topic. But one sort of lesson that or conclusion that I draw from, that prehistory to the project was that, one, I felt it sort of more important to find an important body of sources before coming to my topic, than rather than doing it the other way around, saying coming to my topic and then finding sources to fit my topic. I find that more to my taste to start with the sources, and that's one thing I think is a feature of all my work. But that said, I think I was interested in engaging some big ideas, and in fact, what turned out to be an almost 400-page book, there are quite a number of master themes, but it's just that I developed them after immersion into these sources, and by engaging these sources instead of sort of cribbing them from some intellectual guru like Bourdieu or someone else. But I want to at least just mention one of the sort of more important themes of the book, which is give you a sense of it. And this has to do with the expressions of superiority and inferiority on both sides of this encounter, the Western visitors to the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s. Because on the one hand, there was this long European tradition before 1917, and I say European, it came to the United States largely via French scholarship of the late 19th century, and also in part from Germany. But this long tradition of viewing Russia as backward, Eastern, Asiatic, non-European. And so from the context of sort of world history, it seemed to me, this notion that the Soviet Union was in many ways superior, more advanced, that was embraced by so many Western intellectuals and artists and professionals and other observers, that was a kind of very unusual and almost unprecedented event in sort of global terms, sort of the reversal of that image from the gendarme of Europe to the socialist society that worked. But what I found as I delved deeper was that, and I emphasized really in the book, was how in certain ways these older notions that Soviet Russia was still in some ways, whether it be culturally or economically or socially, was still viewed as behind or inferior. And this persisted, interestingly enough, even among some of the most notorious sympathizers and fellow travelers. And in fact, a good number of liberals who were not at all communists and committed to things like civil rights at home were able to sympathize with the Bolsheviks, A, because it was always this was despotic Russia, and so you were going to have this anyway, and B, because the Bolsheviks were so bent on rapidly modernizing and transforming the backward, inferior Russian and Eurasian populations. So you see, this complicates the story of the kind of sycophantic Western admirers that is so strong in, for example, a book like Paul Hollander's. If you shift that lens of superiority and inferiority, which is sort of mixed and complicated on the Western side now after 1917, you have a similar picture on the Soviet side in terms of Soviet ideology. The Leninist orthodoxy of the 1920s was that the new Soviet regime would take the best from the advanced capitalist countries and then go beyond it. But the almost unquestioned notion was that the Soviet Union still had much to learn from the most industrialized countries of Central Western Europe and the United States. And so this then shifted, and it was really, I think, one of the more dramatic shifts in Soviet history. By the 1930s, everything Soviet was declared superior. And I call this the Stalinist superiority complex. So it's not just the political system or the social system, but Soviet superiority was asserted also in culture and even in economics. And this is a sort of epochal shift in the official ideology towards the outside world, but it left many unofficial sentiments of admiration and fascination and even exaggerated respect for the West that mixed with this official superiority complex. So looking at the foreign visitors allowed me to get underneath, in a certain way, the official ideology and to look how sentiments of superiority and inferiority were also kind of complicated on the Soviet side. And in general, contacts with the West remain crucial and I think formative both for the elites and for Stalinism more generally, even as travel restrictions and autarky and the isolation of the country more general reached unprecedented proportions. So to sum it up, this inferiority-superiority theme was for me sort of two things. One, it was a way of looking at the sources, kind of reading the sources to tease out certain aspects of these, the reception of the visitors and the encounter, but also it was, and how those things were mixing and actually influencing one another on both sides, but it was also part of this big narrative about bringing the whole topic about Russia and the West into the Soviet age, because the topic of Russia and the West and foreign visitors has been so important for earlier periods of Russian history, including for Muscovite and imperial Russia, but hadn't yet been sort of conceptualized as such in the Soviet period. And I think perhaps for a couple of reasons that I might speculate on, but just on this theme of superiority and inferiority, I can't resist saying that last week the book was reviewed in the London Review of Books by Sheila Fitzpatrick, and a long review of several books, where she expressed a bit of skepticism about my whole theme of superiority and inferiority. And I know a bit churlish of me to mention because there was a long and quite interesting discussion there, but I still can't resist, responding to my first critics. But saying that, I mean, her point was that, some of these leading Soviet intellectuals who were most involved with the Western visitors, people like Tretyakov, Sergei Tretyakov, or Ilya Ehrenburg, they felt no sense of inferiority to the West. And so my handling of this was perhaps even a bit, exaggerated. But, some of the Bolshevik intellectuals felt no inferiority. I have no problem acknowledging that, and I can basically agree with the proposition. But you can see from what I've said that I'm not really dealing with that so much only on a biographical level. I'm dealing with it as on a kind of systemic level, as what's going on in both the image of the Soviet Union abroad and in Soviet ideology and sort of Soviet, the evolution of the Soviet system. So it's a much bigger theme than just how people felt in relation to foreigners. It's a systemic sort of, it has a systemic dimension. So one of my kind of fondest goals for this book was to get at the international dimensions in the creation of the Soviet system. And I think here there's been a shift in the literature that I'm participating in, and that's that the two founding generations in the Soviet field that we're now in a kind of third or post-Soviet field, but the founding generations were really the totalitarian school, to simplify quite a bit and generalize with a shorthand kind of description, and the totalitarian school stressing controls from above, and the revisionist school stressing social forces from below, but both of them really focused relentlessly almost on the internal dimensions of the development of the Soviet system. And so their grand narratives were different and opposite and reacting to one another, but they were not really dealing with international affairs. And to me it seemed that the way the Soviets were constantly dealing with the outside world, either to engage and convert them or to combat and protect themselves against them. There are two twin themes in Soviet political culture, the optimistic belief that one could convert and engage was very strong, but then the xenophobic, the security concerns, the quest for purity and the fear of contagion. Those are both going on throughout a kind of complex balance. And so in the conclusion to this book, I argue this historiographical point that in a regime that had global aspirations, it had a frequently obsessive concern with what was often called the cultured West, and it was set in this kind of multinational communist mecca, which foreigners were streaming into, and it was served by these kind of cosmopolitan and very well-traveled political and cultural elites. The history of that was largely de-internationalized, and so I'm participating in a kind of movement to bring that back. And so once the black box, the Soviet side of the interaction, is restored, you can then reinterpret the famous Western visits to the early Soviet Union. And to, on the topic of Western intellectuals and communism, I basically argue against monocausal explanations of Western apologies for Stalinism. To make a very long story very short, what I've emphasized is, one, that the Western visitors and fellow travelers were far from a homogeneous group. Two, that there was more criticism and skepticism than allowed for in previous works, and more skepticism expressed, especially if you look at what they were saying inside the Soviet Union and the unpublished sources like diaries and letters. And so that leads to the point, why were so many of the published works, why did they involve self-censorship? And I think we have to explain that through many of their really long-term connections with the Soviet system and Soviet intellectuals. And that's my third point, that interaction with the Soviets, both on the ground inside the country and in these kind of long-term relationships, was a key factor that was influencing outcomes. And this was the case both in terms of the experiences of travelers inside the Soviet Union, but also what was going on in the friendship societies and the Soviet diplomats and intellectuals who are traveling abroad. And just to give you a sense of the types of people I'm dealing with, these included some of the Bolshevik giants like Bukharin and Karl Radek and Maxim Gorky, but also a key figure in my book, Olga Kameneva, sister of Trotsky, wife of Politburo member Kamenev, who was the head of Vox in the 1920s. And then you also have a whole group of kind of Soviet writers who are not necessarily communists, like Ehrenburg, and you have avant-gardists such as Kritika and a range of others. So the final thing that I'll say here is that as I delved more into this, I became more and more interested in not dealing only with the leftist side of the political spectrum and the leftist visitors, but with all parts of the political spectrum. And the most consistent source of non-leftist fascination for Bolshevism and Stalinism came from Weimar Germany and from the extreme right. And one of my major efforts was to investigate the visits and what you might call the ideological entanglements between pre-1933 far-right extreme nationalist, or what you might call fascist intellectuals, and the Soviet Union. These people, many of them went under the name of German National Bolsheviks, but there were also some members of the Nazi Party, and they had a rather, especially in the early 30s, a formalized relationship with Vox and the organs of Soviet cultural diplomacy. And it's a little known fact that some of these right-wing German nationalists had not only interactions with the Soviets, but even visited the Soviet Union. So I think I'll stop there and ask for, take any kind of questions you'd like to raise about anything I've said.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll throw a question out there, and that comes to what you were saying at the end about the visits of the German National Bolsheviks. I mean, we know, if we look at what happened in the Comintern and in general in the 1930s, that Stalin, and I suppose the people around him, underestimated and misunderstood the nature of fascism, well, and particularly the before Hitler came to power, but even afterwards maybe, do you think to some extent that was a product of these encounters with these Germans?
A lot of people have really tried to find out what Stalin was thinking about the rise of the Nazis, especially after the electoral victory in 1930, when it really seemed the Soviet observers are talking about the fascistization of Germany. So this is fascizatia is the term they use. So it's not exactly unexpected that they are on the rise. The question is how they evaluate that rise. And I do think that, first of all, there's a lot of clues that Stalin himself was not too concerned with what was going on in Germany. Partly this has to do with the theoretic, a lot of people have written about this without any kind of archives, but the notion that fascism was just a form of bourgeois capitalism, and it wasn't. But I think more concretely, what I think one can establish, at least what I tried to piece together various fragmentary bits of evidence, especially from Karl Radek, who was at that point Stalin's chief German advisor, and there are some high-level sources that are available, that there's a constant stream of these rightists coming into interaction either in Moscow, some of the visitors, or in the German Soviet embassy in Berlin, who are basically assuring the Soviets that they will try to continue the military and political cooperation that began. And so some of just the information that the Soviets are receiving is channeled through those groups that have a most vested interest in maintaining the relation. There are some attempts to set up, connections between certain Nazis and the Stalin leadership. Those don't really come to much, but I think it's a very interesting, I call this a boomerang, because the Soviets tried to kind of manipulate the Germans. They're interested especially in converting some of the right intellectuals to communism, and there was a kind of attempt in Germany on both sides. The fascists, the Nazis, are also trying to convert some communists. So this is part of a political struggle that has an internal German dimension. But the Soviets have their own agendas, and they try to, one of the boomerangs is that they get fed information that leads them to kind of wrong conclusions about the danger that would occur to Soviet-German relations if the Nazis would come to power. And that's precisely what happened. It was a big shock for them pretty much in 1934. So yeah.
Thank you. Questions, comments? Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Your book is of special interest to me because my own research deals with the texts of Russian writers coming to America and the images of Americans who come to Russia. So I studied the American text of Russian literature. And I can confirm that this complex of superiority and inferiority really exists. And I'm interested in rhetorical strategies of combining this admiration and this complex of inferiority. It's interesting that Russian writers like Gorky, Yesenin, and Mayakovsky, who come to Russia, they recognize familiar features in America, and they try to compare America and Russia. For example, Mayakovsky says that in America he could see the pre-October Yelets or Kanatop in America. So it seems that when many engineers are coming to America to learn how can Russian engineers and ideologists still state that the Soviet Union is superior. And they are doing it by appropriating America. They are saying that everything in America is only on the surface. And so even the development of technology is superficial. Like Mayakovsky says, it's a miracle that happened to children. But in Russia, we will be able to build our own real technological country. And I'm interested in if you are looking at how Russians portrayed those Americans coming to Russia.
Yes, absolutely. I think, I think there's, the literary representations and the ideological, and then the encounters are often three distinct areas, but there are connections among them. And but I think that I'll make 2 points. One is that what came to be clear was that for the Soviets, America was a special subset of the West. So it was seen as kind of younger culturally than Europe, and sort of the image that you mentioned of children is very common. It's very common in Ilf and Petrov as well, in One Story America. So there's this notion that the Soviets can replace Europe in kind of, having this special connection with the United States. So that's a kind of almost utopian aspiration. And here I like Alexander Etkin's treatment, where he sees that Soviet views of America are almost equally utopian in some senses as American views of the Soviet Union, but they're sort of looking at each other from afar. But that's the image of Americanism in Soviet culture. Efficiency, the land of the skyscraper. This is a very special part of the West. So it's sort of more backward and childlike culturally, but more advanced technologically. And you see that actually informs various concrete interactions, which have their own dynamics and is their own sphere, as I try to show in the book. But one other just thing I'll mention was that, the book that the Soviet leadership and Soviet elites really read the most was Ilf and Petrov's One Story America. So that when you have Mikoyan going to the United States and learning, he visits Ford's factories, and he writes back. He's almost ecstatic about all these processed foods and canned foods. He wants to open hamburger stands. They would have been called Mikoyans instead of McDonald's. He talks about machines that can churn out thousands of steaks a minute. But he also writes to Kaganovich, but still these Americans are narrow specialists. They only care about their technical expertise. They don't have a broad view of culture. And Kaganovich is the most brutal and illiterate member of the Soviet Politburo, but they're agreeing on how childlike the Americans are. So I think it's quite interesting.
Yes, just to continue the discussion, I think the question is really interesting. I'm Tiana in the Kennan Institute, Wilson Center. So, Michael, I have several questions. So first, how can you define Soviet mentality, part of this superiority complex, and whether you think this mentality have changed, or it is still present in Russia today? And speaking about values, which values do you think are important for Russians today, and which are the main priority, like first level American values? So the differences in values, and like a short biographical question to you is that why, if you can tell a little bit your personal story, why you became interested in studying Soviet Union and Russia.
Okay, well, I often tell people that my grandfather came from Mogilev-Podolsky, which is, far western Ukraine. But so when I went to college, I had to pass a language exam, and I slept through my French exam. So I decided to take another language, and I picked Russian, which was a quite difficult language, and immersed me in the language. But the reason I picked Russian was not mainly because of my grandfather. Always subconsciously, it may have, I didn't choose Swahili, I chose Russian. But those were the years of perestroika, and what I was interested was, the Cold War, the left, the image of the enemy, and that was really political issues that initially drew me in. But with the study of language and culture, it kind of expanded from there. But I think, I think one thing is that one thing I'm trying to do is establish that the more you look at the functioning of the Soviet system, the more you have different actors, different agendas, and even within Stalinism, sometimes things that are quite in tension and almost contradictory. So I've even come to question the notion of Stalinism as a single unified phenomenon because it encompasses so many different radical sub-periods. So that's one thing that, it's hard to generalize about Soviet values as a whole, but I do think that there were some things that allowed, for example, true believers in the early Soviet period to see themselves as superior. They didn't care so, even because everything, first of all, was in the future-oriented. So even if economically or culturally they still had a long ways to go, they saw the future as the main orientation point. And that, I think, has become quite different. It's specific to the early Soviet period in particular. And second, they see a real ideological superiority. And there's a real, especially in the 20s, a sense that, an asceticism in revolutionary culture. So addiction to bourgeois luxuries is seen as a flaw among the Western visitors, not as a sign of a more advanced material culture. And also, you see also increasingly after the late 20s with a certain isolation in the Soviet Union, a lack on the new cadres of the Stalin Revolution, a lack of real knowledge on how Western economies work. And you see even when some Politburo members, I forget which one it was, went to Vienna, he said they were showing all the stores stocked with goods. They set it up specially for me, because he thought that this could not possibly. So there's a sense that, there's a basic isolation that leads to a lot of misunderstandings on both sides, I would say. But I do see a certain continuity, first of all, with a certain cyclical process in Russian Soviet history, so that a recognition of the need to catch up with the West often comes along with international defeats and crises internally, such as 1991, which leads to one of the most pro-Western periods in all of Russian history. And then there's a reaction against that, a sense of trying to reassert Russian or Soviet superiority that we've seen after 2001. So to me, this fits very logically into the long durée of Russian and Soviet history, and you see a little bit of that in the shift between the 20s and the 30s. And that's a little bit, it's more complicated than that, and I try to explain the nuances in the book, but I fear that if I were to try to do that now, we would be here a lot longer than we would have to be.
Hi, I have a question and a brief personal story. I left the Soviet Union in 1979, and before that I worked for in Turist for a year. And I had learned Polish, and that was my Polish and Czech tours. So that was group of социалистических стран. But 1979 was also the year of the 50th anniversary of creation of Inturist. And I did this kind of красный следопыт work where I interviewed old workers of the Inturist who worked there in 1929, 1930s. And I remember this walks, and I was just wondering, did it then become Inturist? Or
no,
was
it's
it
actually
still
a big part. It's a
separate?
big chunk of one of my chapters deals precisely with this question. Unfortunately, the Inturist archive was largely destroyed during the war, but not completely. There were still some very interesting. But it was created. There were a series of attempts as more non-leftist, non-communist visitors came in to take advantage of the financial dimensions of foreign travel. And these foreigners were known as valютные иностранцы in the 20s. And Vox had a proposal to take advantage of it, but it lost out in Turist, which was created as an joint stock, an акционерное общество, and the agendas were to really capitalize for the industrialization drive on extracting hard currency. So there were often intense battles between Vox and Inturist. Vox thought of them as commercial. Of course, they were also highly political. So Vox often misunderstood, but they did end up controlling much of the infrastructure of new hotels that were constructed after 1930, and they become a far bigger and more dominant organization than Vox in the course of the 1930s. But so there's a complicated relationship between the two, and Vox saw itself as taking into account the individual cultural and ideological needs of each visitor, and not, this tradition of not trying to exploit them commercially. And so actually there were some very intense conflicts in the early 30s that essentially Vox lost out on. But both organizations were decimated in the Great Purges because of their connections with foreigners. But I want to say one thing about the guides, because in the late Soviet Union, I also knew some guides, and they were really, they did their jobs and they said their official lines, but they were often really interested in meeting the foreigners, and they knew the languages, and that's why they went into that line of business. And I found the same for the Vox guides and some of the other figures who worked with foreigners starting in the 20s, that some of them had been really inspired by contacts with foreigners to devote their careers to having this role, and it gave them a sort of interesting, and there were all sorts of pressures and regulations and political issues they had to deal with, but they were motivated in part by admiration. And you see sort of the personal interactions that could often have these profound effects, and you see this in some of the memoir literature. Some of these people actually wrote about their early lives in the 20s and 30s after 91, and I was able to find some of those writings, how there's this sort of element, the unofficial element, which is so important to these kinds of cultural contacts, which often sometimes goes against their official role.
Yes, in the back.
Was there a religious element to this interchange? I'm thinking of the fact that the Tsarist regime had been notably anti-Semitic. I presume at this point the anti-Semitic nature of the Soviet regime had not become apparent. And I wonder, did that figure in either direction of the interchange?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that if you're interested in this, I think there's Yuri Syoskin's book on now I'm forgetting the name. Remind me, Angela. The Jewish Century, of course, the Jewish Century, where he talks about the three strands of the Jewish diaspora. There's one in Israel, one in the United States, and one that remains in the Soviet Union, and also at least through the 30s. There's the assimilated Jewry, the Soviet Jewry rises way up into the political establishment and into even the secret police. And you do have some, elements of some official anti-Semitism, but it's really not until late 40s that comes to the fore. And so the image of the Soviet Union among, for example, United States Jewry is extremely positive. One of my own relatives, who was, I discovered this in the course of it, was a Yiddish writer named David Apatashu, who was my second cousin, who visited the Soviet Union. I'm sorry, Joseph Apatashu. David was his son, who became an actor. But Joseph, his reception, they had his works in Yiddish. They were all read. It seemed like Yiddish was becoming a literary language, which was something he was trying to defend. And they knew his work, and he was greeted as a celebrity. So that was a big part of the reception of foreign writers and artists. I found even one case where an artist his work was stored in the basement of the Tretyakov Gallery. They moved it out into a prominent place in the permanent collection just for his visit. So they went to quite extraordinary lengths. But I think that the nostalgia among the Jewish emigration that came from Tsarist Russia in the late 19th and early 20th century, and then often had leftist political tendencies, although not necessarily communist, that was tapped into by the early Soviet state. And so it's really only, the key turning point is the creation of the State of Israel. and this fits into broader Soviet nationality policy. Whenever there's a foreign state that could potentially draw the loyalties of Soviet citizens, this is reason for a crackdown, and that's one of the key factors in the sort of the initiation of the anti-cosmopolitan campaign.
Questions? Yeah.
Well, I was wondering if you give specifics in the book. You alluded to the fact that people who came there, that they talked different on the outside than their notes showed on the inside. And I wonder if, like, particular people like Bertrand Russell or Lincoln Steffens and that was named the famous old man, all who spoke very highly of the Soviet Union, were they just speaking because that was their clientele? Did they really believe what they were saying, or?
Well, that's a good question, because I wasn't able to elaborate on that. But there were some who, I think someone like Steffens, that famous quote about the future that worked, or, those people I'm not so much thinking about. I'm thinking about the group of people who became known as Friends of the Soviet Union. These were these were sort of a subgroup of fellow travelers, and that they were the ones who were celebrated inside the Soviet Union. This is another aspect of Stalinism that has gone almost completely unobserved, but printed in millions of copies. I'm thinking of Dreiser, of Romain Rolland. I'm thinking of all the figures who were, to a certain extent, Paul Robeson and others who were lionized within the Soviet Union, but also had long-term relations either with the friendship societies or with the communist parties in their own country and with the Soviet organs of cultural diplomacy. Feuchtwanger is another one. And they had reason, when someone like Dreiser was very brutal in his criticisms in his unpublished diary. But you have it documented. He sends a letter saying, now that I'm home, I don't want to damage an idealistic experiment, and I'm going to, he basically suppresses his criticism, in part because he wants to use the image of the Soviet Union for his own internal debates within the United States, and he even goes as far as to say the United States will someday be Sovietized. And, so there's a real disparity between them, and he makes a conscious decision. For others, Romain Rolland has a Russian wife who's his sort of mediator, very interesting figure in her own right, Maria Kudashova. Feuchtwanger, it's anti-fascism, and he's an anti-fascist from even before 1933, and he really sees that the Soviet Union is the only ally against Nazi Germany, and he makes a conscious decision. Gide is an exception because he suppresses a lot of things, but at a certain point in the middle of his visit, he makes a decision, I'm not going to do this anymore, I'm going to criticize the Soviets openly, and he's subject to an entire campaign of vilification. But another key factor here is that the Soviets made it very clear to these foreigners that the one thing they needed to maintain their status as friend of the Soviet Union, both abroad and internally within Soviet culture, was not to publicly criticize the regime. That was made amply clear to them. They were not stupid. They understood this. And, this was a factor, I think, in influencing the outcomes.
Was there a common theme of the private criticism in these individuals' diaries that they?
There really, you could make a typology of it. There's this new German dissertation that, analyzes 150 travelogues and slices and dices them every which way and says statistical tables on them. I don't find, I think that there are some, but I would emphasize more that for some that for one thing, the Soviet myth, and this is where Francois Furet's book on communism is so interesting. He talks about it as a political myth of the 20th century. It's incredibly flexible. People can come to a positive view of the Soviet Union from many, many different directions, both political, cultural, social. And so there's that, and there are different sub-periods of Soviet history where the regime appears quite different to outsiders as well. So there's that. But oftentimes you see that many foreign intellectuals have a certain area that makes them most attractive. For some it's the welfare state and social reform, kind of Hull House, Jane Addams types who are from the liberals from the United States, progressives. They're interested in social welfare measures. Others are more from the workers' movement, the labor movement. For Gide, it's actually sexuality. He's, writes about, he's one of the first kind of open literary advocates of homosexual rights, and he sees a sexual revolution occurring. And then when they passed the law against male homosexuality in 1934, it begins a process of disillusionment. For others, it's practical questions of they want access, they have delusions of influence, and when those are not fulfilled, they have a breaking. For others, it's the information about the terror. And so I try to emphasize, actually, rather what I see in the literature is an attempt to kind of essentialize and all intellectuals and all fellow travelers into a kind of a master explanation. And what I've tried to do is emphasize the different paths, the diversity of it. But that said, I think that this theme of having a master, one issue that has especially drawn them and then disillusioned them, and then having these aspirations for influencing people, revolutionaries in power, it really leads to this image of Stalin as an intellectual in power, which is quite common among the leading fellow travelers, and the mystique of power often leads them into this, because he's receiving them in Kremlin audiences, and that's where the practical influence of these organized visits, where they're treated to this red carpet treatment, and they're shown the extent to which they're published and having an influence in Soviet culture, and meeting with Stalin personally has this influence, that has for this leading group a profound effect.
During the Soviet, after the World War and the revolution, the economics in the Soviet Union went really very down, and the new economic politics NEP was created that boosted the middle class and actually was very effective. I was wondering if you come across something interesting from the Soviet side or the Western side, related to this new economic politics, and as well as what it has been done after the middle class was created and flourished, what has been done with the same class, with like the same government.
One, I'd say that it's paradoxical that with the introduction of NEP, some of the positive views were more muted because it was seen as a compromise with capitalism, and this was, so it's one of the key paradoxes of the height of Western enthusiasm came with the first phases of Stalinism and the industrialization drive, which correspond to the Great Depression in the West. So even in the, even the Mensheviks and the moderate socialists abroad are accusing the Soviets of a retreat and sort of backtracking, and so it leads to a certain muting of political enthusiasm. So many of the leading fellow travelers of the late 20s and early 30s, including Roland, Gide, others who had no previous strong connections with the Soviets in the 20s, and in some cases were actually quite critical of them, then become fellow travelers. So that's one aspect of the NEP. I mean, just from, it has a huge impact on the whole way that foreigners are received and treated. One of the things I've already alluded to, with NEP, there's a certain, the notion of Hazrat, the profit, that industries have to show a certain profit. That leads to an interest in foreigners from the, the financial aspect and the hard currency aspect that by the mid-20s has already, come to the fore. And the whole system of receiving them in the early years of sort of, if they're politically sympathetic, you simply give them everything for free. That has a long afterlife, but it sort of, is modified very significantly under NEP. But the other thing, I mean, the image of the NEP man and the kulak as internal class enemies, this is something that also is a way of explaining repression and violence to these outside audiences, so that to a certain extent the foreigners are brought into this notion. And from the point of view of internal Soviet developments, the connection of internal enemies to external enemies is becoming a key factor in what will then ultimately emerge in the Great Terror. And so this is another, I think, very important theme, is how people are classified as friends or enemies, both internally by the Soviets, and also the foreigners are subject to that same classification.
You know, we have beautiful spread out there. We've had a great discussion. I know there's some more questions. Why don't we just repair there, come back here, and please join me in thanking Professor David Potts.